Hey everybody, this is Mark Clements, Artistic Director of Milwaukee Rep here, continuing our What's the Tea series. And the idea of this is that I have a guest over for tea, British style, and we share a cup of tea over the virtual kitchen table where we discuss the ills and woes of the world. And actually, it's kind of my guest today is Chris Jones, Chief Theater Critic with the Chicago Tribune, an esteemed journalist, and all good round theater guy, an expert, and one of the most influential theater critics in the world today. And so I'm really honored to have him joining us. We do share a couple of things. We are both British Americans. And so the notion of the tea idea will be not lost on Chris. And so welcome, Chris. Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Are you drinking a cup of tea there? What
I
have
am.
you got there?
My Broadway in Chicago mug, looking good, looking good.
Beautiful. What's in it?
Delicious cup of tea. What else? It's that time of the
Just
morning.
a basic British, yeah, cup of tea. I've gone more herbal. Actually, do you say herbal or herbal after all these years?
But I don't drink it, so I don't say anything. So, but herbal, I guess. Yeah.
Herbal. Yeah.
I'm still your
I think
people.
I've definitely. So in mine is actually I've gone fully herbal today. It's ginger and lemon, and I feel like I'm doing myself good with all this viral stuff around. It makes me feel better about myself anyway, that I'm anesthetizing myself. So the first thing I guess is to talk about is, I was thinking about you the other night, and I guess myself in terms of what we normally do. For somebody who has literally spent every night in the theater, I mean, or like 5 to 6 times a week
Yeah.
for the last 3 decades plus, and then suddenly in the last 3 or 4 weeks, that has changed. Talk me through that transition.
Well, I guess it begins for me in the week that Broadway closed down. So I went to see, my plan had been to see the Broadway openings of Six, and followed by the Tracy Letts play, The Minutes, which were opening on, I think this was about the 11th and 12th of March. It was a Wednesday and Thursday. The Tribune had told people not to travel, but I thought to myself, I'm a critic. There's a show opening on Broadway. So I actually, this seems really ridiculous. I actually sought and got special permission to go and review Broadway. So I go Wednesday night to Six, and it is becoming clear during the day that, things were not going well there. And I walk into the theater. I stay in my hotel to the last minute. I walk in, and it's the same as ever. Every seat's taken. All the Broadway gossips are working the aisles, and I'm thinking this is not tenable for very long. And I actually ran out of the theater. I've never been a critic. Some critics leave the second the show ends. I kind of like the bows, and I like watching the audience, and I never do that. But on this night, I did. I'm like, I don't want to be stuck in a line of people. I'm going to get out of here. I got out of Six. I went to my favorite watering hole in New York, which is a restaurant called Under Trois. And I go there. I meet two of my friends there, and we say to each other, "This is the last night. It's all over." And they're like, "Don't throw away this program because this is going to be a historic night." We sit in the corner of the restaurant, and then I come out of the restaurant and I walk back to my hotel in Times Square across this windswept, unfamiliar sort of territory. And then the next morning, the theaters all close. I write that story for the New York Daily News and the Tribune. And then I go to LaGuardia, and I think I'm just going to try and get a flight. And I go to LaGuardia and I get myself on a flight and I come home. And that's the last time I really left the house in any meaningful way. And that's the last show I saw. And it's been the longest in my life since I was, I would say, I started going to the theatre in high school back in the UK in Manchester when I was about 15. And this is the longest I've ever been in that intervening, actually 4 decades now since I started going to the theatre. And so here I sit, writing obituaries of people, frankly, and writing about financial crisis in the theatre, and writing about, what we're all going to do. And that's become my life.
Yeah, I think it's the pace in which it slowed down. I mean, I think you just encapsulated that perfectly. It was. I feel like there was some sense of denial. At
Yeah.
first that this couldn't be as enormous as this. And then it kind of escalated into something really, really seriously. We certainly had that. I think we were the first theater in Milwaukee to shut our operations down because we just realized what was going on and we wanted to get ahead of the curve, and literally how our whole working day has restructured, and just weird things. You must be getting this all the time where you suddenly get a ping of an email and it's like, it's time for you to check into your Delta flight to Atlanta or whatever.
Right.
And you go, the inconceivable. By the way, Cafe Un Deux Trois, I'm surprised we never run into each other because that's usually my watering hole post show. And actually, it was the very first.
I hope they're able to come back because, like a lot of those midtown businesses that we like, they're all dependent on Broadway theater. So they're all closed. And my fear is that them won't reopen again.
Yeah, it was my first dinner I ever ate in New York City, my first visit to New York City. And that night, it's always had a particular affection for me. But I think you're right. Yeah, I mean, let's segue into, I guess, I mean, you're the pro, the sort of, first off, what are the things you're worried about? I read your article, which I thought was really interesting and smart about, well, listen, we're focusing on audiences coming back together and working out when it's safe to do that. But how does that work for actors and performers whose the very performances of which we do are about connectivity, about physical interaction, literally, intimacy? How do when are the actors going to feel safe? And I thought that was an interesting article for those that didn't read it. Could you just sort of frame that up, that conversation?
Yeah, I think a lot of these issues, we're very focused on when will audiences feel safe to come back to the theater. And, that's a very difficult guess at this point. There's so many different guesses. It's, I wonder about how useful it really is. The short answer right now is we simply have no idea when they'll feel safe or how they will feel safe, whether some of them will feel safe. Will younger people come back before older people? I've been talking on Twitter this morning, about this argument about will small spaces come back before big spaces? And of course, one of the issues there is that small spaces, like we have in Chicago and like you have in Milwaukee, a lot of them, they're often more crowded than big spaces. So on some levels, people will be saying, maybe I'm, I feel safer at Wrigley Field or Miller Park or whatever than I do in a tiny storefront. So that's a sort of a question. One friend of mine who works in the theater is absolutely convinced none of this ends until there's a vaccine. But then when you look at the estimates of when a vaccine will arrive, Mark, you end up thinking, well, how many theaters will survive that? If we're talking a year and a half or 2 years without revenue, that's going to be very difficult for a lot of theaters to get through that. So, the other issues for audiences, I think number one is the vaccine. Number two is, do we come up with some therapeutic medicines that make people's fear go away, or at least remediate people's fear that if you get really sick with this, we're going to have this medicine for you and the odds of you being on a ventilator shrink. So that, I think, is a factor. And then the third factor for audiences, I think, is the availability, or the question really of how many of us have these antibodies that, indicate that we have some immunity, at least potentially. And that if that's a large sector of the population, then I think, we'll come back quicker than if it's not. And as you and I sit here, we do not know the answer to that because there's been no meaningful testing in this country at all, which is, of course, the great atrocity of what's going, well, one of them, but definitely one of the great atrocities of what we're going through. So then I think all of that, applies greatly to actors. I was talking with Miguel Cervantes, who's playing Hamilton on Broadway right now. And he said to me, he said, Chris, I kiss two different women in that show. I really kiss them, two different women every time. I kiss them several times. How could we do Hamilton without that? And you think to yourself, I'm sure you've been thinking as a director about, am I going to block shows differently? Am I going to have actors? Am I going to get rid of those big hot sex scenes? Or, there's a scene, I was talking to Kate Shindle from Actors Equity, and she was referencing the scene in The Inheritance, the very great play by Matthew Lopez about sort of AIDS, a previous play. And there's in that production, Stephen Daldry's production, there's a moment, this is going to sound strange, but it's true, where, an actor like spits and another actor, literally has to clean up that's the blocking of the show. The other actor like cleans that up. And there's a variety of people hugging. There's a whole scene in The Inheritance where 30, 40 guys hug. That's the scene. It is very hard to imagine theater avoiding those things. And I know that
that thought occurred to me. We just literally finished a run at Milwaukee Rep of Hedwig and the Angry Inch, and we turned our space into like a club. So a lot of the seating was table seating in front of the stage, and obviously it is a direct address kind of piece. But there was so much interaction between the actor playing Hedwig and the sitting on their laps doing, the famous car wash, sort of spitting liquid out, which actually feels almost as tantamount as crazy as, in this country at least, aiming a gun at an audience. I mean, it has the same kind of impact. And it really, and I was like, wow, how do we, if we were doing that and bringing that back, and it was a show that was a huge success for us and turning people away. So obviously it's been on our radar to do that. But I was like, how would I reconfigure the staging of that? Would we want to kind of, the proximity between the audience, which was one of the big successes of that show, how do we do that? And I don't have the answers right now. I'm figuring it out because a lot of what we're doing is just triage on our theater companies and making sure that people stay with us for this journey and keep the faith with us, and that's how we're spending our days and hours. I know my counterparts are doing that because I speak to a dozen of them, most days.
Right. Well, I think too, if you drill that down further to like actor training, you think about one of the core principles of most actor training in the US. If there's any students watching us right now, I mean, this is what you're doing. You're sort of learning to trust your impulses, and you're sort of reacting to a text, you're reacting to a scene partner, and you're not constantly checking yourself about those things. And that the great actors that we admire have been trained in this way of going with a feeling. And often those feelings that actors sort of learn how to deal with in a scene, they're physically manifest. It leads into a hug, or it leads. So really, it's at the very core of what an actor does. And it's worth pointing out that they're going to have to do this. They're going to have to worry about this also in TV production and also in Hollywood, because right now, when those TV shows go back into production, they're going to have to deal with sets that are in a whole other place. They might not have to worry so much as you about the audience part of it, because the audience can socially distance, but the actors, it's not any different really, right, from a theater production.
I think we're going to have to see the curve flatten and continuing a degree of sensible distancing, and I think I know a lot of theaters are thinking about that. How do we do that? So as a slow incremental feedback. Something I did hear about Broadway, you'd probably be more in tune with this than me, but what I'm hearing with this ever moving date of Broadway and June the 7th or something being cited, and I saw your commentary on that as well, saying I'm not so sure about that. July seems a stretch, but one of the things I was hearing was interesting was this sort of incremental filtering back. So, for example, that restaurants would need to be open 4 to 5 weeks slowly before then Broadway then layered in. And I'm watching. Have you heard anything similar to that?
Well, I think if you look at what Governor Cuomo was sort of a tad disparaging yesterday about Broadway, he's like, Broadway, like we got other things to, we got other things to worry about, which, on one level, that's right. That's true. He does. On the other hand, it's a massive industry. And for a lot of people, it's their livelihood. And, in previous crises like 9/11, Broadway was a key component of recovery. Like, when I did my book on Broadway, Rise Up, you and I talked about this. And right after 9/11, the theaters were open Thursday night. One of the great miracles ever in New York was the fact that those theaters got back up. People found a way to do it because actors wanted to do it. They believed in it. It became an act of solidarity. It's hard now, though, to fit that idea of the way people in the theater think, which is, yeah, I'll do a show. People need me. It's hard now to think of that because there is an ethical imperative with an audience that you, Mark, do not want to put anybody at risk. And you would not want someone to see your show if it was to put them at risk. And so that, I think, has created this much more problematic kind of setup. On the other hand, I do think theaters have some things in common with the music industry. And even with professional sports, that are, when people are back at watching baseball, they'll probably be back at the Milwaukee Rep. Those two things probably won't happen that far apart. And if you think of some of the bars in Milwaukee with live bands, those are worse, frankly, from a social distancing point of view than anything you're doing at the Milwaukee Rep. They are crowded. There's probably poor ventilation. People are moving around. People are physically, if you think of your main stage, it's not socially distanced, but it's better than that. I think you would agree. Now, what I don't know is, could you do a show in your main stage where you were selling a seat every 9 feet? Could you do that, do you think?
I think that's the scenario we are running, actually. What does that look like? Could you create a situation where you only sold 50 or 60% of your seats and you gave everybody an option to move if they wanted to create social distancing between themselves? I think that's something that, we need to run the logistics of and the business model of, see how that figures out. I do actually think that in some ways, I think the pressure on a lot of regional theaters who work on a similar sort of season to us is that, where you wind up somewhere between, and I'm not including the summer theaters here because they're really hemorrhaging right now, but yes. I'm talking about our kind of operation that sort of works from, the fall through early, through late spring, sometimes into June. We tend to start producing September performances September, and we finish around about the end of May. The scenarios that we're running are like maybe moving it forward. So right now, what you're seeing is the DNC, which is a huge thing for Milwaukee, is now moving to August. What I'm hearing about MLB is that they are looking after where the All-Star game would be played, so around about July 7th or 4th, I've heard. Summerfest, the largest rock festival in the world still in Milwaukee, is now moving from the last week of June and into July, over the July 4th weekend, now to the first 9 days of September. So you're seeing people incrementally building time ahead where they think where we minimize those risks of be coming back too soon, I think. And I think, you know, the curious thing about this is the scenario that you run in good faith and you think is really prudent today, like 4 days later, is redundant, and you have to go back again.
Well, I think too, we are conditioned to thinking about a hard end. So the way we all think is that one day, you know, it is easier for us to think in terms of when does it end, to really the reality is there's no hard end. It will be, anything that happens is going to be incremental. That's the thing.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it so hard in our world, I think, Mark, right? Because it's very difficult for the theater to come back incrementally. It's just very, very difficult. Yeah. That's really true on Broadway. And I do think it's likely that the regionals like you, theaters, the big nonprofits in cities, medium-sized cities like Milwaukee, will be back before Broadway in many ways. And it will probably be safer to be at the Milwaukee Rep than it will be at Hamilton in the middle of Midtown, where obviously the situation is more difficult. So I do think that's likely. It's just hard because we can't quite get our heads around how much of this change is permanent and whether we can all adjust what we do to sort of follow into a new world order or not. That I think really is the nub of where we're at, and the answer is we just don't know.
No, I do think that once we see major sporting events come back, I do think human beings are incredibly resilient, and they will see that as a cue. The question will be whether we come back too soon. I do think there will be certain things that remain in place. I was never particularly a germaphobe, but I can't imagine now that I won't always have assuming I can actually get one at the store, a small bottle of hand sanitizer in my pocket and just do it. And I think that will start. I think that will help. I mean, and maybe we will start adopting a certain degree of general hygiene that probably we should have been doing years ago, to be honest.
Right. That's right. I think that's right.
Because, as we know, type A flu has, the last stat I read was that it killed 18,000 people in America this year. And obviously we're not focused on that right now because we don't want to be misleading about this dreadful new strain of the disease. But I think I think once it happens, it will move back too quick. It will move back quick. Whether it's too quick will be another thing. I just want to finish up, maybe looking, what do you think, right? Maybe you can't answer this and you shouldn't feel obliged to answer it if you can't, but out of this, what do you see as I hate the term silver lining, but I actually can't think of a better. What do you think might come out of this? What are you seeing that might be a useful takeaway?
Well, I think probably the biggest one would be people having time to write and to create excellent works. I think, like any creative act, a lot of what I review in the theater, a lot of the new plays I review were rushed. They were rushed in the writing. They were rushed in the rehearsal room probably. And so I think you might sort of say this pause will allow some people, some of our great writers maybe, to really focus in on their work in a way that's not all that possible when somebody's emailing you about asking you to go to Milwaukee and be part of the rehearsal process. So they're going to get a break from that, some of the writers. And so maybe that will, allow people who are very talented, who have never written the really ambitious work that we're going to want when we come out of this. I think that's the silver lining. I also think the theater, in my view anyway, Mark, is at its best when it focuses on, when it gives people hope, and when it focuses on our commonalities as human beings and on our fragility and on our mortality, and that looks at it all together And I think that a lot of the work that's come out of the last decade has been more about internal strife, you might say. I don't think that should go away, but I think artists are gonna realize that what audiences are gonna want is you know, if they're gonna walk out of their house in the new world into your theater, they're gonna want something that is special and that makes them feel and that gives them something that they feel it has gone from their lives. And so I think smart people like you all know that about this moment. And I think that might create at theaters like yours some really powerful, important work. And I think that's probably what I'm most hopeful for, Mark.
You know, it's funny you should mention that, because the conversation that the artistic team, Mayor Giles and myself, and the artistic team had yesterday, is that, you know, what can we do? What are the opportunities here? And we actually focused on new writing, because we were like, so often, you know, we have these great writers, but they're in the middle of, suddenly they're great, and then they get a Netflix series, and there's, you know, like a huge demand on them. So actually now these writers are in conversation with us and have a little bit more time to actually spend a little more gestation time on these plays, think about it. And actually we've decided, well, we're creating some online content like a lot of other theater companies, and we commissioned 10 writers to do 3 to 4 minute monologues as a response, which are starting to go out. Idris Goodwin did a terrific one the other day. We got Rick Cleveland actually doing one, which I'm recording later today. But we're actually also going to do 4 or 5 new commissions, because we actually feel this is a time where we have that money that was restricted funds specifically for that purpose. And the one thing often that is against us is time. It's actually in our favor right now for those writers. So I think you're right. We see that as an opportunity, and an opportunity to give the writers feed the pipeline, pay them some money, and also have a chance to be able to write the play that they really wanted to write, or spend a little bit more time on, and they had to make some choices because they were working on 4 or 5 other projects. So I think your theory is right, and that was very much in line with the thinking that that we were having too. So I feel optimistic about that too.
Oh, good. All right.
Listen, man, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I really appreciate you and everything you're doing, and thank you for taking the time to have a cuppa with me.
All right. Good health. Good health, everybody in Milwaukee.
Good health, everybody. Take care. Thanks, Chris.